In this second lecture tonight, we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark. But before we do, the question was asked about this Olivet Discourse. What is that? So you can see on the screen, if y'all can make that larger so my friends at home can see this. You can see that I've got my Bible program open to Matthew 24. And notice the heading here, Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple. The Olivet Discourse is called the Olivet Discourse because of where it takes place. And where do you think? Mount of Olives. So Jesus is with his disciples on the Mount of Olives when he gives this discourse. And you can just see as you look at the title what it's about. He foretells the destruction of the temple, which takes place later in 70 A.D. at the hand of the Romans. He talks about signs at the end of the age, abomination of desolation. There's so much you can get into here. Coming of the Son of Man, lesson of the fig tree. No one knows the day or the hour. Then it goes over into chapter 25, where you have the parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the talents, and then the final judgment, where you have Christ coming in his glory and the sheep on the right hand and the goats on the left, right? And then when you get to chapter 26, verse 1, listen, and it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these sayings. So that's that last transition phrase that's in the Gospel of Matthew before he begins the narrative again to tell about the last days of Jesus' ministry before his crucifixion and resurrection. So that's what the Olivet Discourse is. It's a discourse, Jesus teaching a lot about end-time judgment to his disciples on the Mount of Olives. And oh, by the way, if I hit the harmony button, notice, look at the synoptics, side by side, just material after material. Matthew's is a little bit longer. Well, a lot longer, actually, as you can see there. Okay? And then in chapter 25, all three of them have all three of them have I'm in 26 now, I'm sorry. 25. Wow, where did I mess up here? Oh, I'm in 25. No wonder I'm not seeing it. Starts in 24, and it goes to 25. That's how it's headed up. That's how the headings read there, okay? But there, that's the Olivet Discourse for those of you who were wondering, what in the world is Brother Mike talking about? I've heard of Sermon on the Mount. I've heard of the kingdom parables. What in the world is this Olivet Discourse? Well, that's what it's about. All of it is. There you go. I'm sorry. Couldn't resist. Okay. Let's get into Mark, okay? The Gospel of Mark. And again, survey. So we're going to be hitting some highlights, some high notes in the Gospel of Mark. Authorship. This is an interesting place to start with the Gospel of Mark because there are some questions that come up. Our Bibles bear the name Mark at the heading of the second Gospel, yet Mark was not one of the original 12 apostles. So how could Mark write a gospel when he was not an apostle? And then I asked this question, what about apostolicity? Now, for some of you that makes, what in the world? But some of you may remember some discussions in other courses about apostolicity. It has to do with New Testament canon. Right, the New Testament canon. New Testament canon has only one N in the middle. If you put two N's in it, that's a military canon, okay? But what's canon, by the way? Yeah, the accepted books. Some of you, I hope, are answering at home. Yeah, the accepted books in the New Testament, okay? Well, some of you will remember that there were some criteria for how books got into the New Testament. One of them was consistency, which just means what? that book had to be consistent with what the rest of the books said, okay? That's one of the things that the early church took into consideration when they were looking at a book of Scripture, okay? Another one would be, let's see, how did I word it in the past? I know what I want to say, like wideness of use. That's what it is, wideness of use. Somebody may have been screaming it at me from one of the other locations. Wideness of use. In other words, it wasn't just a book used in one region, but all around the Mediterranean world, this book had been received as Scripture. But the third criteria that was used in the development of the New Testament canon is this thing right here, apostolicity. How do you spell? I got it right. Apostolicity. Apostolicity, which just means this, that somehow or another that book can be traced back to an apostle. Okay? Now, Matthew was easy. Why? Matthew was an apostle. And John will be easy. Why? John's an apostle. But what about Mark? If he's not an apostle, then why would the early church receive his gospel as part of the New Testament canon? So we turn, first of all, to an important statement from a second century church leader. This is what we were talking about earlier when we talked about external evidence. Okay? So we're going to church history here. A second century church leader, which means he lived when? He lived in the hundreds, the 100s AD, okay? So this is within a century or so after the time of the apostles. His name is Papias. He lived in what is today modern-day Western Turkey, which is close to where the Apostle John ministered, by the way. Paul did as well, but the Apostle John lived there in this region. So Papias lived from 60 to around 130. So you can see that's really close to the time of Christ and the disciples, okay? All right, so here's his quotes. Rather long. You must memorize it for the... No, you don't. All right, here we go. Ready? This is his quote. And it's from Eusebius, by the way, who wrote Ecclesiastical History. This also John the Apostle used to say. So Papias is quoting John, who he knew. Okay? So John the Apostle used to say, Mark indeed, who became the interpreter of Peter, note that, wrote accurately as far as he remembered them, the things said or done by the Lord, but not, however, in order. So now if this is reliable, and I've got no reason to think it's not, then Papias is saying, John told me that Mark's gospel was based on Peter's recollections of what happened in the life of Jesus. But Mark wasn't trying to set down in exact order everything that happened. He was getting the gist of it, and he's got pretty much the order in which the ministry of Jesus took place. Anyway, for Mark, had neither heard the Lord, so Papias is saying Mark was not an eyewitness of the Lord's, an ear witness of the Lord's teachings, right? Nor been a personal follower, but at a later stage, as I said, he had followed Peter, who used to adapt the teachings to the needs of the moment, but not as though he were drawing up a connected account of the oracles of the Lord, so that Mark committed no error in writing certain matters just as he remembered them. For he had only one object in view, namely, to leave out nothing of the things which he had heard, and to include no false statement among them. Okay, so what is Papias saying about the Gospel of Mark? The Gospel of Mark, he says, is his recollection of what he heard from Peter. Okay? And then he wrote it down, and of course we still believe in inspiration and infallibility and inerrancy. Okay? But this is the means that God used then to give us this second gospel. Okay, so authorship again attributed to Mark. So from this quotation, we gain the following insights. The individual named Mark wrote it. Mark Tudor, Mark Harding, who? That's what we got to find out next, all right? But anyway, yeah, an individual named Mark wrote the second gospel. He was not a first-hand witness. We gathered that from Papias' statement. He was not a first-hand witness, but received eyewitness testimony from the Apostle Peter. Thus, Mark gives his gospel account under the apostolic influence of Peter. And so that's going to answer what question up here? The last one, apostolicity, okay? Not apostasy. That's something different, okay? Apostolicity, yeah. Mark did not seek to write his account. This is another thing we glean from Papias' statement. Mark did not seek to write his account with a precise order, but rather desired to give an overall account of the life of Christ. So now the question becomes then, okay, who is this Mark? Who is it? And y'all probably know this from previous studies. Most New Testament scholars identify the author of the Gospel of Mark with John Mark of the book of Acts. So you want to lay your eyes on his name a few times. Look at Acts chapter 12. I think I got these references right. Acts chapter 12. And let's see, verse 12. Here we go. Yes. And when he had considered the thing, so we got to go back and find out who the he is. We're talking about Peter. When he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And then he's mentioned again in verse...
Is that not when he broke out of prison?
Yes, when he was...
I always remember this part. Peter goes to John Mark's family's house after he breaks out of prison.
After he's delivered.
Right.
Yeah,
so it kind of tells you how close Peter was to
Right.
John Mark's family.
Yes.
And that's whose house he went to.
Yes, and that would demonstrate,
Right.
like you're saying, a
The
closeness
connection.
of relationship. Good insight there, brother. Barnabas, verse 25 at the end of the chapter, Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry and took with them John, whose surname was Mark. And of course, you're going to remember then, okay, this is the John Mark that accompanies them on the first missionary journey. But then, about halfway through it, he decides to go home. And then the next time Paul and Barnabas decide to go out, Barnabas wants to take Mark again, and Paul says, no, it ain't happening. And Barnabas says, oh, yeah, it is. And Paul says, oh, no, it isn't. And there was well, how does Luke say it? There was no small dissension. Can you imagine that? But that's what it says. Huh? Maybe.
Because, I mean, if Mark was not an eyewitness of Jesus,
Yeah.
I mean, the
He was a
timing
younger
of that.
man. Yeah,
was
he
a
would have been a
younger
younger man at this time.
I mean,
I think so.
He could have been a little boy when Peter was delivered from prison, going back to the house.
Yeah. Could have been. Or at least a young man. Yeah. Anyway, so Paul and Barnabas split up over John Mark, over this guy, this gospel writer. Okay, they split up over this guy. So evidently, but by the time Paul comes to the end of his ministry, he says, "Send Mark, for he's of great use to me, great advantage." So who was this John Mark? Okay, now you look at this bullet point here. He was the cousin. Now, I know because of the way the King James reads. Let's go over to Colossians 4:10. Yeah, it sounds like, we would be tempted to say nephew because of the way the King James text reads. Let's see, Colossians 4:10. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas. But if the Greek word here, anepsios, if you look at it in the lexicons, which are the Greek dictionaries, they all suggest that the term needs to be translated cousin. And so if you look at another translation like the ESV or the New American Standard or something like that, they translate it as cousin, all right? It's not going to make a difference at all in your interpretation of the story. It's just, what do you feel about their relationship? I remember growing up hearing that John Mark was Barnabas' nephew, okay? but based on the meaning of this word, I think it's really possible that they're cousins. Okay, but either way. All right. Mark is mentioned in letters of Paul. We just read the Colossians 4:10 text. Hey, let's look at that 2 Timothy text real quick. 2 Timothy 4:11. So this is Paul's last letter. Y'all know that, right? 2 Timothy is Paul's last letter. And somebody says, no, it isn't. Titus and then Philemon. But I'm talking about chronologically. This is his last letter. This is the one where he says, I fought my fight, a good fight. I finished the course. I've kept the faith. Well, look at what he says at the end of the book. Chapter 4, verse 11. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with you. Bring him with thee. And then notice what he says. For he is profitable to me for the ministry. So, a couple of things. Either Mark grew up and matured. Maybe Paul kind of mellowed out, chilled out a little bit, right? It could be maybe a combination of both. I mean, they both were sinners. I think we know that, right? Okay. So, anyway, regardless of how it comes to pass, Mark is profitable for Paul, and so Paul requests his presence. And then he is mentioned in the book of Philemon as well. Now, here's another thing that's interesting. Oh, by the way, here's what I'm stressing. I should have shown you this. He was cousin of Barnabas and interacted closely. I failed to read this to y'all. Interacted closely with Paul and Peter. Okay? Especially during their time in Rome. Now, why was Paul in Rome during this time? He was a prisoner, right? Y'all know the story in the book of Acts, okay? He's a prisoner who had been taken to Rome. Peter also was in Rome at this time. And we won't take time to turn, but in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, Peter mentions the church at Babylon. But Peter wasn't in Babylon. We're sure of that, okay? He was in Rome. So Babylon in this passage is code. It's code for Rome, okay? John does the same thing in the book of Revelation. He uses the term Babylon, and it's obvious he's got Rome on his mind. Why do you think they would use Babylon for Rome? Think about it this way. In the Old Testament, who were the destroyers and the persecutors of Judea? Babylon, okay? By this time in New Testament history, Rome is starting to persecute the church, okay? And so it's probably the reason why Peter uses Babylon instead of the term Rome. Plus, it may have also just been to protect the identity, of his letter and audience and so on, yeah. Okay. Recipients. Who gets this book of Mark? Who gets it? Most likely, the recipients of this gospel are those who make up the church at Rome. Why would we say that? Evidence seems to point to the fact that Mark's in Rome. He's there with Paul. He's there with Peter. Good evidence that that's a good place to start right there. Good evidence that he's writing to.
During that time frame.
I'm sorry, say it again.
A lot of persecution toward Christians building in that time frame.
Yes, yeah.
They were there.
And so they're going to need the story of Jesus, right, in written form. Yeah. Okay. Other things that suggest Mark writes to Gentiles. His translation of Aramaic expressions. Y'all know what Aramaic is? Aramaic is a Semitic language that is very closely kin to Hebrew. Okay? Very closely kin to Hebrew. And if you look in a text like Mark chapter 5, and let's see, verse 41. Well, let's see here. And he took the damsel by the hand and said unto her, ready? Talitha Kumai. That's Aramaic. That's Aramaic. And then what does Mark do? He translates it for him, which is being interpreted, damsel, I say unto you, arise. So that's you can look at the chapter. Well, let's just do it. Chapter 7, verse 34. And looking up to heaven, he sighed, that's Christ, he sighed, and says unto him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. So Mark is actually taking the time to translate some Aramaic for his readers. Now, what would that lead you to think? They don't. It's an audience that doesn't know Aramaic, okay? And so he's translated it for them. So these would more than likely then be Gentiles and not people that lived, in and around the land of Palestine, okay? He explains Jewish customs. That's also in chapter 7. Look at verse. This is that I mentioned this in the last lecture. Jesus and the disciples are eating with unwashed hands. Verse 2. And so the scribes are finding fault. And then Mark takes the time to explain why the scribes are finding fault and the Pharisees are finding fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands off, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. He probably wouldn't explain that if it was a Jewish audience, right? So that, again, leads us to think, okay, he's writing to Gentiles. Okay, date. What do you think we're going to say? Before what? Before the destruction of Jerusalem, okay? Again, because the Olivet Discourse is in the Gospel of Mark, okay? But in that discourse, at no time is it ever hinted that this has already taken place. It's projected into the future, okay, in the Gospel of Mark. So that's why we place it at in an earlier time than AD 70. So it's basically the same thing we said about Matthew. This leads us to believe that Mark was written prior to AD 70. Now, I'm not going to get into this much. In fact, this is the only time I'm going to mention it. But during the break, Brother James and Brother Cliff were talking to me about, did the gospel writers have access to other gospel writers' books? Okay? And they asked me, they said, is that even a thing? Trust me, that's a thing. It's a big thing in New Testament scholarship. It's something called source criticism, is what it's called. Don't get turned off by the word criticism. It just means that they study the relationship of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So some scholars, again, I'm not going to get into it deep, okay? But some scholars argue for the priority of Mark, which just means this. They think Mark's the earliest, that it was written first. I've read both sides of this debate, okay? Mark written first, and then they believe that Matthew and Luke had access to Mark's gospel, okay? Which then, would place Mark maybe before 60 into the 50s. And I've seen a lot of scholars that hold to that Mark is the earliest by far of the gospel accounts. And I was showing them this too. When you buy, you were going to do it, when you buy Robertson's Harmony of the Gospels and you look at the columns, which column is first? Mark. Mark is first. Every time. And if Mark's included. Now, if it's Matthew and Luke, then Mark won't be in there. But the reason Mark is included first is because A.T. Robertson held to Mark in priority. That's why it appears the way it does in this book. Okay? That's all. I'm not even going to ask you this on a quiz. All right? But yes, it is a thing. It is a thing. Okay. Mark's approach. So we looked at Matthew's approach. Matthew, his approach is to tell us about the infancy and the baptism, the temptation, and then to get into this narrative discourse. Okay? Mark's approach is going to be similar in that he's going to follow that basic synoptic template, which is what? Jesus is being baptized, Jesus in Galilee, Jesus in Jerusalem. Mark's going to do the basic same thing here, okay? Mark's first words, let's look at them. Very important. Mark's first words, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It lacks a verb. If you don't know what verbs are, trust me, there's not one there. Okay? You should know what verbs are. But there's no verb here. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so it's this first verse is really functioning as the title of the book. This is the title of the book, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Mark makes use of the term gospel, which if you don't know what that is, it's euangelion. If you want to see it in English, it's like this: EUANG. That it's a double gamma there, but it's NGELION. Euangelion. That's the word. That's the Greek word for gospel. Okay, and if you took that U and made it a V, then what would you have? Yeah, now you see where the word evangelist comes from. It actually comes from that Greek term, okay? Mark uses the term gospel. This is significant. He uses the term gospel 8 times. Matthew only uses it 4 times, and Luke and John never use it. At least Luke doesn't use it in his gospel. Luke does use it a couple of times in another book that he wrote. What other book did Luke write? Acts. So he does use the gospel a couple of times in Acts, but he never uses the term in his gospel. Now, who do you think uses the term gospel more than anybody? Exactly. Exactly. You're thinking. So Caleb said Paul, and he's right. Paul uses the term gospel more than anybody does in the New Testament. And Mark is gospel heavy in his use of the term, which again, indicates, okay, this is the John Mark that accompanied Paul. That's internal evidence, in looking at the way that the books can be compared. Okay. Still talking about Mark's approach, as we noted earlier. I just said this a moment ago. The Synoptic Gospels arrange their material geographically, progressing from Jesus' baptism in the Jordan to his ministry in Galilee and then on to Jerusalem. So that's what we saw last night. So Mark follows this basic scheme in his approach to the life of Christ. And whereas Matthew, the other synoptics, Matthew and Luke, they have material about the infancy, right? Mark doesn't start there. Mark starts at the beginning. He hits the ground running when he presents his gospel. So his approach is one that gets immediately to the issue of the ministry of Christ. In fact, if you've got your Bible open to Mark chapter 1, we read verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then what happens? As it is written in the prophets. And he got John the Baptist. That's right, Caleb. Got John the Baptist immediately. Behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare thy way before thee. Oh, this is interesting. As it is written in the prophets. So verse 2 is one prophet, and verse 3 is another. Do you know who it is? No? Who is it in verse 2 that's being quoted? Malachi. That's from the gospel of Malachi. That's from the minor prophet Malachi. Yes, that's from Malachi. And then verse 3 is from Isaiah. Yeah. Isaiah chapter 40. Come on, guys. Y'all should know that. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare you the way of the Lord, make his path straight. So when Mark says, as it's written in the prophets, he's got Malachi and Isaiah in mind, at least here. And then you'll notice, verse 4, John baptizes. So see, immediately, Mark's gospel is an action. That's right, Brother Charlie. It is an action gospel. Okay? Quick-paced, fast-paced. So there are no birth narratives in the Gospel of Mark, no incidents from the childhood of Jesus. So that whole story about Jesus going to the temple when he was 12, you just know, I'm not going to go to Mark for that. It's not in there. Where are you going to go for that? Anybody know? Where are you going to? You're going to go to Luke. Yeah, you're going to go to Luke for that. But you're going to go to Luke for that. Okay? No, so no incidents from the child of Jesus. And then you actually have an abbreviated account of the baptism and temptation. For example, look at verse 9. And it came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized of John in Jordan. So no discussion between John and Jesus, right? Like you have in Matthew. No discussion. And by the way, again, we're going to hit this Friday night a little bit more, okay? And straightway, pay attention to that word straightway, because I'm going to tell you something about it in a minute. Straightway coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens opened and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him, and there came a voice from heaven saying, Thou art my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. And immediately, hear how fast it is? Immediately the Spirit drives him into the wilderness, and he was there in the wilderness 40 days, tempted of Satan, and he's with the wild beasts. Oh boy, it's tempting right now to talk about some last Adam thoughts there. Anyway, and the angels ministered unto him. Verse 14, John's in prison already. Yeah, so John's in prison by the time you get to chapter 1:14. What'd you say, brother? Now, months have gone by. That's right. So much has happened. So John's hitting the store, or John Mark, thank you. I can say it that way. John Mark is hitting the story quickly, very quickly. Note Mark's use, next slide. Note Mark's use of eutheos. Did y'all see eutheos as we were reading? Well, it's the word straightway or immediately. It's used 19 times in his gospel, okay? And immediately this happened, and immediately this happened. But here's one that's really kind of cool to me. The Greek word kai, kappa, alpha, iota, it just means and. It's incredible how many times it shows up at the beginning of verses. 35 times in the first chapter alone. A verse begins with the word and. And this happened, and this happened, and this happened. So you get the idea that Mark is off to the races, right? He's telling his story. He's telling it quickly. And it doesn't surprise us when you stop and think about it. He's the shortest. He's by a long shot, the shortest of the Gospels.
As fast as he can.
Say it again.
It's almost like Peter's talking and he's writing as fast as he can.
He's writing as fast as he can. Yeah. So it is a very fast-paced book. Very fast-paced. Another thing to take note of, many scholars have noted how Mark's account of the life of Jesus mirrors the sermon Peter preached in the household of Cornelius. Now, you remember that story? Cornelius receives a vision. Your prayer's been heard. Send for Peter. Meanwhile, Peter's in Joppa getting visions of sheets falling with catfish and lobster and bacon and shrimp and all that good stuff. Yeah. Yes. And anyway, so Peter ends up going to the household of Cornelius and preaches a sermon. All right, so I don't know if this showed up. Did this show up in the notes? What I've got in front of you here? It did not show up. It came out as a blank page. You've got it? Not in that format, but it's there, okay. Yeah, here, I didn't know how it would print out. You know, just as a side note, we were talking about this, the guys that are here, we were talking about, I could save these files as individual slides, but then when you printed a page, man, it'd be one slide after the other. Now, you could do 3 slides on a page or 6, but then they start getting real small. So it's hard to please everybody. Anyway, you can hopefully see on the screen there. Am I in the way on the screen with this thing? You took me out. I'm invisible right now on the video. That's fine, because I want them to be able to see the screen. So you can see Peter's sermon down the left-hand column, and then Mark's gospel down the right-hand column. And so that sermon follows this pattern. First of all, preaching the gospel. That word euangelizo is the word for preaching the gospel. And that's where Mark's gospel begins, with the same basic statement. Then in verse 38, Peter mentioned that God had anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit. Mark's gospel picks up the same theme very early on. And then Peter actually mentions beginning in Galilee, right? And of course, most of Mark's gospel is going to be concerned with the Galilean ministry. And then Peter mentions in his sermon that Jesus went about doing good and healing all that were oppressed of the devil. And lo and behold, that's quite a bit of that in the Gospel of Mark. And then Peter preaches and says, we are witnesses of all these things, which he did both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem. And Mark's Gospel devotes 4 chapters there, 11, 12, 13. Yeah, 4 chapters to the ministry of Jesus in Jerusalem. And then whom they slew and hanged on a tree, focused on the crucifixion. And then God raised up the 3rd day. He showed him openly. And of course, Mark has the resurrection account as well. So Mark's gospel does in many ways mirror Peter's sermon. This again would be external evidence pointing toward Mark's relationship with the apostle Peter. Okay. All right, still talking about Mark's approach. One of the things I do want us to note is how Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi is the hinge upon which the story Mark tells hinges. Okay? This is the turning point in the story that Mark tells. So go to chapter 8. Chapter 8. And again, just so you see it happening, I'm going to minimize that slide. I'm going to pull up my Bible program so you can see it. Okay, so let's say that I was studying this passage. So Mark's Gospel, chapter 8, and what did I tell you to go to? 26. So I'm going to highlight. I'm going to 27. Okay, I'm going to highlight 27. Now watch what happens when I go up to Harmony again. I get all 3 accounts. So see, this is. I'm just showing you this. This is how you would use it. Yeah, Mark's not first in the eSword program. But I don't think it's because of any particular bias that the editors have. I think it's because of the canonical order, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But anyway, so you can see here, if you went to the Harmony in your eSword, you would see all 3 accounts side by side, in every one of them, with the exception of Luke. Well, see, this is where it's fun. You start comparing things. Matthew mentions Caesarea Philippi. Mark mentions Caesarea Philippi, but guess what Luke doesn't mention? At least not in this text. Caesarea Philippi, he doesn't mention it. It may be earlier up in the text. But they all 3 record the same thing. Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? Mark, whom do men say that I am? Luke, who do people say I am? Okay, but it's the same question, okay? And then you have Peter's answer. Some say you're John the Baptist. Some say you're Elijah. Some say you're Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And then Jesus asks what question? Who do you say that I am? And Peter answers what? Thou art the Christ. There it is again. Thou art the Christ. Now Matthew adds the Son of the living God, whereas Mark simply says, you are the Christ. Listen to the way Luke records it. You are the Christ of God. Okay, now come on, think with me. Remember what I told you last night. You got different witnesses, but it's to the same event. Okay, so don't get all bent out of shape. Oh no, 2 of these have to be wrong. Okay, no, we wouldn't get bent out of shape about that. They're telling the same story. Okay, and it could be that if we really, could do a deep dive into this, we might find that the way they record these answers further, in certain ways, the purpose of the book. Okay, I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there as a suggestion. Okay. All right. Only Matthew records this part where Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you. My Father which is in heaven. Upon this rock I'll build my church. Mark and Luke don't record that, at least not here. They don't record that. All right, but we're talking about Mark, right? And the thing that I wanted you to see, let me go back to the Let me go back to the slide, okay? So this is the hinge. This passage is the hinge passage in the Gospel of Mark. Okay, it's like everything's leading up to it. And now once this happens, the focus of the gospel turns toward Jesus' future suffering in Jerusalem. So prior to this event, look at the notes. Let me pull this back up full screen. Here we go. So prior to the record of this event, the stress of Mark's gospel is upon Christ's power over disease and over devils. And this is what leads Peter to Peter's confession. You're the Christ. That's who you are. After this event, the Gospel of Mark focuses primarily on the suffering and death of Jesus. So if you got your Bible open to chapter 8, so we just talked about verses 27 to 30. Oh, by the way, I'm going to talk more about this in a minute. Notice what verse 30 says. He charged them that they should tell no man. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But then notice what happens in verse 31. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things. So right here is where Mark's gospel begins to emphasize the future sufferings of Jesus in Jerusalem. And Mark includes that 3 times now. There's 3 different times in the Gospel of Mark where we're going to have that coming from Jesus. I've got to go to Jerusalem. I've got to suffer many things at the hands of the chief priests and elders and be crucified. And rise. He told them that too. And rise the 3rd day. So you have the combination then of these 2 themes coming together. First half of the book is primarily about Christ being this powerful Messiah who has power over diseases and over devils, and he's that great deliverer that the Old Testament promised. And then after the Caesarea Philippi incident, he's the Messiah suffering. He's the one that's going to go to Jerusalem and suffer for the sins of his people. So here's an outline. This is not near as full as the one I gave you on Matthew. And again, not asking you to memorize this. I do, as I said last night, want you to know that 7-point overview of the life of Jesus. Okay, but that was in last night's lecture. I do want you to know that. But I'm not asking you to memorize these outlines of Matthew and Mark. But here's the way the book basically works. Prologue. And then the Galilean ministry, Mark sort of breaks it up into 3 parts. Then you have the path to suffering, with the major divide being what we just talked about. Chapter 8, verses 27 to 30. Then you got Jesus' final ministry in Jerusalem, and then finally his passion and empty tomb. And I could have added there, and his ascension. Mark actually mentions it. We did this last week in our Zoom meeting. I asked a question: how many Gospels contain the ascension? At first, people were saying none, but that's incorrect. 2 of them contain reference to the ascension. One of them is Mark, and one of them is Luke. Okay? All right. Major themes in Mark. I'm looking at the clock. We're doing okay, I think. Okay, major themes in Mark. First of all, I want to talk about this thing called Messianic secret. Messianic secret. We just read one of the texts a moment ago. Don't tell any man who I am. This is something that you find repeated quite a bit in the Gospel of Mark. For instance, go back to chapter 1. Chapter 1 of Mark. So here, let's see, starting in verse 23. There was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, saying, "Let us alone. What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Art thou come to destroy us? I know thee who thou art, the Holy One of God." So boy, then this devil knows immediately who Jesus is. And listen to what Jesus, in the synagogue, the devil went to church. Ready? Jesus rebuked him, saying, hold thy peace. In other words, shut up. I don't know what you're talking about. Do not be talking about me. You see it? Hold your peace. Well, come on. He's the Son of God. Shouldn't he be? Jesus says, I want you talking about that right now. Hold your peace and come out of the man. Same chapter, verse 34. He healed many that were sick of different diseases, and cast out devils, and suffered not the devils to speak because they knew him. Okay, so just those first two texts, what are you gathering from that? He wants it to be a secret. That's a big deal in Mark's gospel, okay? And of course, then you start asking the question, why? Why? Chapter 3, verse 12. Again, the context, unclean spirits. Verse 11, and unclean spirits, when they saw him, fell down before him and cried, saying, Thou art the Son of God. And he straightly charged them that they should not make him known. Shut up. Yeah, right. Chapter 5, verse 43. Now, this time it's not demons, but it is about a healing. Verse 41, he takes the damsel by the hand. He says unto her, Talitha Kumai. Remember what I told you that is? That's Aramaic, which is being interpreted, damsel, I say unto thee, arise. And straightway, there's that eutheos word again immediately. Straightway, the damsel arose and walked, for she was of the age of 12. And they were astonished with great astonishment, and he charged them straitly that no man should know it. Don't tell anybody what I've done here. You find that interesting, right? I mean, why is he doing this? Not like this in Mark. Not like it is in Mark. I'm not going to say it's not in any of the other Gospels. I need to look, but it's Mark who stresses this. Mark stresses this. Chapter 8, verse 30. We've already read this one. This was after Peter's confession about Jesus being the Christ. And he says in verse 30, Jesus charged them that they should tell no man. And then the final one is interesting. Chapter 9. After the transfiguration, and they come from the mountain. Verse 9, he charged them that they should tell no man what things they had seen. Watch this. Till the Son of Man were risen from the dead. So he's telling them even then about his future resurrection. Okay, so those are texts that all focus on this idea of keeping it quiet. So in these texts, Jesus silences demons who know who he is. He tells people he healed, not to tell anyone about him. And he even tells his disciples not to speak of his identity. So why the secrecy? Why the messianic secret? So this is just kind of working through the issue here. Jesus guarding his identity for most of his earthly ministry is typically referred to as the messianic secret. So the often asked question is, why? Why was he so careful to keep his identity hidden? Is this in your notes? Okay, so yeah, this is stuff that I worked on later this afternoon, okay? Or actually, it's earlier this afternoon now. But in order to answer this question, it's helpful to consider the common messianic expectations. Now think about what I'm saying. Common messianic expectations of first century Jews. What were they looking for? Yeah, exactly. A king that's going to rule and reign and overthrow Rome and bring in justice, right? All those things. That's what they're looking for. Most of the Jews were looking for a Messiah who would be a political revolutionary. They were looking for a king who would come in and release the nation from Roman domination. In short, that's what they wanted, was a political savior. Okay? And that's not what he comes to do. Exactly. I don't know. You probably couldn't hear what Brother Cliff just said, but if this is how they begin to look at Jesus early on in his ministry, it's going to be a hindrance to him and to what he's actually there to do. What he's actually there to do. So while it is true that the Old Testament portrays the Jewish Messiah as a world ruler, I mean, go back and think about some of the things we talked about in the Old Testament. That the Messiah would come and that he would rule and reign and the nations would come to him and bow before him, right? So they were right in one respect as how they read the Old Testament regarding the Messiah. He would be a world ruler. Yeah. He would bring in everlasting justice. There was great misunderstanding, however, as to how he would do it and when that would take place. So the Jews of Jesus' day failed to grasp the expectations of messianic suffering. That's what they didn't get. They read with delight the passages of him ruling, of him reigning, of him dashing to pieces pottery, right, with a rod of iron. Man, they read those things. Establishing the throne of David, yeah, and the Gentiles coming and bowing before it. They read those things, but what they failed to pick up on is the theme of messianic suffering that's found in the Scripture. And Isaiah 53 is a good example of that, right? Everybody in here knows Isaiah 53, right? Wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. He's despised, right? We did not esteem him. He's a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. You know the passage. And they weren't as quick to apply that to the Messiah as they were these triumphant texts. Okay? So Jesus most likely, this is my attempt, and look, this is not new to me, okay? I've done some reading. So Jesus most likely kept his identity hidden so that he would not encourage these incomplete expectations and bring upon himself the wrath of the Roman government before the appointed time. There was an appointed time for Jesus to die. In fact, we may pick up on this when we get to Thursday night. One of the things that John's gospel keeps mentioning is this: my hour. That's something unique to John. My hour has not yet come. Okay? Jesus, I believe this is the best way to approach this secrecy theme, by saying Jesus didn't want all of that emphasis upon his messianic identity, especially at the beginning of his ministry. Now at the end of one of the things you do find happening in the Gospel of Mark is that secrecy tapers off. After chapter 9, it doesn't happen again. As we're getting closer to the cross, that no longer happens. Okay? Which again, I think, lends credence to what I'm saying to you now. Okay? So that's the whole thing about the messianic secret. So if you've ever read that anywhere and wonder what's that about, that's what it's about. Mark's emphasis upon keep it quiet. Okay? All right. A few more things and we're going to quit. Passion announcements. I mentioned this a moment ago. When I say passion announcements, I'm talking about what? His death. His death. Luke actually uses that term in chapter 1 of the book of Acts. So these passion announcements, 3 times after Peter's confession, Jesus announces his upcoming death and resurrection. We've already read 8:31, where it says, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Chapter 9, if you want to look at that, chapter 9, verse 30, and they departed thence and passed through Galilee, and he would not that any man should know it. So even that's done secretly. For he taught his disciples and said unto them, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, and they shall kill him, And after that he is killed, he shall rise the third day. And this is an interesting commentary, but they understood not that saying, and were afraid to ask him. Isn't that interesting? Chapter 10 and verse 32. They were in the way going up to Jerusalem. Again, think about the synoptic order. He leaves Galilee, he's headed into Jerusalem. They were going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus went before them, and they were amazed, and they followed. And as they followed, they were afraid. And he took again the 12 and began to tell them what things should happen unto him, saying, Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be delivered unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles, and they shall mock him, and shall scourge him, and shall spit upon him, and shall kill him. And the third day he shall rise again. He never once told them about his passion, Brother Bryant, without also mentioning his resurrection, that he would rise from the dead. So after the first two announcements, and you can read this on your own because we're about out of time, okay? But after the first two announcements, Mark provides a record of how the disciples responded. How did Peter respond after the first one? Y'all remember? Oh, this will never happen to you. Never will it happen to you. And Matthew's gospel records where Jesus says, what? Get behind me, Satan. Yeah. Oh, you know what? Mark's does too. Mark's does too. In 8:33, Jesus rebuked Peter, saying, Get thee behind me, Satan. For you savor not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men. So the first two announcements, we have the disciples' response. Let's see. Oh, yeah, we read this one in 9:32. They didn't understand the saying, but they were afraid to ask him. After each announcement, after each of these passion announcements, Jesus takes time to teach his disciples something about self-denial and about humility. Like, let's try the chapter 8. I know we're about out of time, but let's try it. Chapter 8. So we've got the confession of Peter in verse 27 to 30. Then we've got Jesus' passion announcement in verse 31. And then Peter rebuking Jesus and Jesus rebuking Peter in verses 32 and 33. Now listen to verse 34. And when he had called the people unto him with his disciples, he said unto them, Whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. So man, to follow me means that you die with me, okay? Okay? Your denial of yourself. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, the same shall save it. Okay? So in every one of these situations, there's always something said about, discipleship, something said about the cost of discipleship. All right. Well, that's Mark's gospel. Again, man, that's just so brief, so short, but hopefully you've picked up a little bit better understanding of the Gospel of Mark. I said, did anybody ask any questions? Man, it's just so clear, huh? So clear. Wow. Man, I'm impressed. Okay. All right. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this, and we will convene again Thursday night. So tomorrow night, we're off. I get the night off tomorrow. Maybe a reminder.